Meanwhile, on the comic box. Gobble, 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 gobble. I'm sorry, I don't know why I did that. Happy Turkey Day, everybody. Welcome to the Comic Box, part of the Geek to Geek podcast network. I'm Rob, your friendly neighborhood comic geek, and our topic this week is Crisis on Infinite Earths, the end of the Bronze Age, I guess. Usually people don't even say Bronze Age for DC. Sorry, we'll get into that. But part one of our two-part coverage of Crisis on Infinite Earths, because this is the all-new, all-different comic box, so trying something different this time. So for this week, the homework was to read up to issue 6 of the series. If you didn't, don't worry. I'm not going into super deep detail. I'm not doing a super dive into the details of the book. We're just going to talk generally about it. And then we're going to talk about what came before, in the days now known as pre-crisis, which is a term you will always hear thrown around by comic book geeks. And then the real-world events that led up to the first DC Comics continuity-shattering mega event. But first, the weekly geekery. Gobble. All right, so clearly it's almost Thanksgiving. I'm recording this the day before, the evening, I should say, before Thanksgiving. So if this comes out afterward, I hope you had a wonderful time with your family. If you are not in the U.S., I hope you did anyway, because it's still a good idea. You know, at its core, the idea of just getting together with family or getting together with friends and just being grateful that even with all the stuff going on in the world that you might not like, agree with, or that might be getting you down, it's always still good to be thankful for the stuff you have. So for me, as far as the weekly geekery, it has been a busy week getting ready with family coming into town. I have still been enjoying my piano. I am now plugging away on season 3 of Penny Dreadful, though very slowly because I'm busy otherwise. And the big thing, of course, is that I saw Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them twice. I went once with the wife and one of her friends, and by a mishap that we will not get into, it comes down to me being stupid and buying the wrong tickets. We ended up seeing it in IMAX, and then I saw it again with Liam and Ray, both of whom have been on the show before, as well as another friend of ours who has not been on the show yet. Liam and I went in costume, as well as our other friend. Liam pulled off a pretty good Hagrid, actually. So, and like I promised, there are pictures. They are up on Twitter, so you can go check those out at Rob's Comic Box, courtesy of Ray, who is our photographer. Super nice guy. I like that, Ray. Short review of the movie. I liked it. I enjoy the opening up of the history and seeing more stories in a world, but I'm also a comic book fan, which means that I'm used to seeing new stories with new characters I haven't met yet, which take place within a world that I'm used to, like the DC universe. So I really enjoyed Void and Beej's episode, sort of just talking about the Harry Potter universe and how they're not as interested, or Beej at least isn't as interested in the, if we want to call it, extended universe or the wizarding world in its entirety, simply because to him it's the story of this one boy who becomes a man over the course of the series. That sounded wrong, but you get what I mean. Who grew up and went through school, and so to him that's the story. That's Harry Potter's story. He's not as interested in the world, where I love it. I love all the Pottermore little snippets, anything I can get my hands on, because I'm that guy. As a comic book fan, you get used to having, this is the world that you're used to, and so for you to truly enjoy it in its entirety, which we'll get into when we talk about Crisis, is knowing who that character is in the corner. And, oh, it's so neat because, you know, that person showed up, even if it's just a little cameo. Stuff like that. I did have some issues with the movie, of course, but overall I liked it. I found that I didn't mind the issues as much the second time around. Liam thought it was okay, also found a lot of issues with it. I think Ray enjoyed it, and the wife did not like it. So there you go. You have a big spectrum out there. So the point being is that you kind of have to go and see it for yourself in order to determine whether or not it's your kind of movie. As for the seeing it in the theater versus seeing it at home, that's tough, because TVs are so big these days. People's home theaters are that. They're home theaters by just buying a television. I will say, though, that I loved the music in this one, and I very much enjoyed listening to the music in the theater, and plus the special effects, obviously, are very entertaining. And if you have a good crowd, that's what I always plug for, is especially opening weekends. If there's a movie you are looking forward to, see it opening weekend so you are in a theater with other people that are as excited as you to see it, because that energy gets passed around. I don't mean that in any sort of metaphysical way, just strictly speaking, if you're in a group of very excited people, it's going to make you more excited. So same reason horror films are great in theaters. So in that sense, I would say go see it in the theater if those are the things that you really want to get, is the big booming sound and the flashing and the bright special effects. Otherwise, yeah, I mean, see it at home, obviously, but everybody's home is a theater now, so I don't even know why I put that in there, if my whole point is it doesn't matter. Yeah, anyway, let's move on. I also got out there this past week and tried to exercise a bit more. I'm really trying to get back into going to the gym on a regular basis and walking. And it snowed, though. Like, it snowed yesterday and it snowed more today. So we'll see how that affects me actually getting out. I didn't do a run streak or anything like Beej had been doing or is possibly continuing to do. But I've gone through 2 episodes of an app called Zombies Run that Void talked about in an episode, I want to say sometime back in the summer. All I remember is I was mowing my lawn while I heard it. So this app is pretty neat, and I think they make you buy later episodes, but the first few are free, and the idea, and this is a really dumbed down explanation, but basically you put in either the distance or time you want to run, and then you plug in your headphones and you can listen to your own music. You can do podcasts, but they only dim what you're listening to, so I would say do music, and then every once in a while the app will break in and say, you know, here's an audio transmission, or we're telling you you need to run here in order to do something, and you don't actually change the direction you're running. It's just in your headphones they're saying, oh, this pack of zombies is coming after you, and your job as a runner for this town is to go out and find supplies or redirect large waves of zombies away from your little settlement. And then if you use the GPS, it'll even track how fast you're going, and you could turn on a thing called chases. So every once in a while, you'll actually get an alarm in your ear saying that they're closing in on you, and you will have to pick up the pace for a short period of time. You're going to have to put on a burst of speed in order to escape these zombies. Otherwise, they'll steal some of the items that you've collected. And which, like I said, I'm not doing it justice. There's so much more to this app, like collecting items and building settlements and stuff. But for the most part, it's just something extra to add in and add a little narrative to your walk or your run if you're able to get outside, if it is not cold and snowy and slushy like it is here. So I don't know how that's going to work, just like walking on a treadmill or running on a treadmill. But I'm going to have to give that a shot. We'll see if it's winter compatible. But that's it. That's it for my weekly geekery. So let's move into some news with the news. Starting with Marvel Comics, Stan Lee was officially recognized for his 75 years of working for Marvel/Disney with a one-of-a-kind little bronze statue, and I don't know if little is the right term. It's sizable. It'll go on his desk, but it's not like in a courtyard somewhere, of Spider-Man and Mickey Mouse together. It was presented to Stan by Bob Iger, the chairman of the Walt Disney Company. If you want to see a picture of that and check out more, go on Twitter and look for the hashtag Staniversary. Staniversary! In Marvel movie news, the MCU now has Spider-Man after a deal that that Marvel Studios brokered with Sony, but don't expect the X-Men to show up anytime soon. That's officially been shut down. Marvel Studios president Kevin Feige said, and this is a quote, "They certainly have enough we meaning the MCU, certainly have enough films to keep us busy for a number of lifetimes, and that, quote, it's an impossibility at this juncture for them to work out a similar deal with Fox as they did with Sony. So you are not going to see Wolverine side by side. We're not going to get to see if his adamantium claws will cut through the vibranium of Captain America's shield. We're not going to see the Fantastic Four show up. We're not going to see the X-Men. And the big one for me that makes this sad is that means I don't get to see Silver Surfer in Guardians 3 or in Infinity Gauntlet, and to me, he sort of embodies Marvel Cosmic, so that's very sad for me because it means I'm probably never going to see the Silver Surfer in live action again after the Rise of the Silver Surfer movie, so sad panda. Upside, speaking of Spider-Man, the very first Spider-Man Homecoming trailer is set to be attached to Rogue One, a Star Wars story. Oh, I'm going to get yelled at by Star Wars fans now. The Rogue One movie that's coming out. So, if you're a nerd of any kind, a geek of any kind, you're going to get a double dose of fun when you go and see Rogue One, which I imagine is going to be an awesome film, and I'll probably still go see in the theater there. But otherwise, if you're not a Star Wars fan, you know it's going to be on YouTube like the next day. I mean, that's kind of the way trailers work. Lastly, for Marvel movies, Deadpool 2. I guess that's a Fox Marvel movie. Wonder if I should separate those. Whatever. Deadpool 2 lost its director due to creative differences and has reportedly found a new one in David Leitch, the director of John Wick. I am guessing that that's really good news. I've heard nothing bad about John Wick. I still haven't seen it. I know, but I still haven't gotten to it yet, but I've heard nothing but good things. So hopefully that means awesome things for Deadpool 2. DC, just one quick piece of DC movie news. We are reportedly going to see at least one member of the Green Lantern Corps in the Justice League movie, which awesome for me as a Green Lantern fan. I'm really curious to see what they do with the Green Lantern Corps, with the uniforms, how they're going to make those happen because, Snyder is big on the CG as well, so we'll kind of see how that goes. I am a little worried that they just keep packing more stuff into this movie. Like, they're trying to make up for the fact that Marvel already has, 14 films out by just doing everything in Justice League. And, but I don't care. I get to see a Green Lantern Corps member that hopefully will be more of just in the corner. Or maybe that's best. Maybe it's best that it's just, a hint of him in the corner so we get, just a taste that'll get us excited for the Green Lantern Corps film, which comes out in 2020. The poll list, which officially is both for this week and next week. So the poll list, here's the stuff I went through very quickly this week. Hal Jordan and the Green Lantern Corps, number 9, Wonder Woman, 11, and Mighty Thor, number 13. I guess I would have to say my pick of the week out of those would be Hal Jordan and the Green Lantern Corps, number 9, just because, and this is a spoiler, kids, 3, 2, 1, the return of Kyle Rayner. Woo! He was always my Green Lantern. He is now the White Lantern, and he appears on the very last panel of this comic. So I'm excited to see what happens there, and I hope they do something interesting with him. As far as Wonder Woman goes, some massive retconning going on there. I'm not going to go into detail on there, but they're basically wiping away everything they've done since the New 52, which is too bad because that initial run in the New 52 was really, really good. For next week, I am looking at the new talent showcase number 1 from DC that I talked about a few episodes ago because I love that idea. However, it's like $8. So I don't want to be that guy that'll flip through it and be like, oh, it's not for, I mean, that's fine, but to flip through it and say it's not for me because you want to support the idea of DC bringing on new talent and getting their work out there. But $8 is a lot of money for a comic book, even if it's double-sized or whatever. So I just hope that if they're charging that much, that they paid the new talent well. But in any case, that's coming out, so I do encourage everyone to at least go check it out. And then there's a new issue of Saga coming, things that I think other people might be interested in. Next week, we are getting the second issue of the latest Serenity miniseries. I did not pick up the first one. I missed it. I missed when that came out. I've read all of the other minis, and I really liked them. So hopefully they're going to continue. And it's building on the story from Firefly and then Serenity. So if you love that world, go and start reading some of the trades that are out there. I'm sure you can find them through your local public library or certainly at your local comic shop. Also, the second trade for Paper Girls, if you've been waiting on trades to read that one, that's one that I was reviewing every single month. There is a new issue of Miss Marvel. And then for you Pokemon fans, especially on the subreddit is blowing up with all things Pokemon. Volume 2 of Pokemon Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire graphic novel is out. is that really the name of the game? Like, that is unnecessary. That is unnecessary, you guys. In any case, it's out. It's only $5, so if by them saying Volume 2, it's actually the size of a regular trade, that's not a bad price. So if you're a Pokemon fan, maybe go check that out, pick it up, see if you're a Pokemon comic book fan. I can tell you nothing about it, except that it has a really long name. The archives for this week actually is going to factor into a Q&A. I got a couple emails this past week. Thank you very much for those. And so I'm going to answer those questions, and as you will see, they will tie into some suggested reading material. So first, I was asked who gave me my very first comic book, and I have no idea. I have to assume it was my mom, because I don't know that it would have been my dad. I mean, not that he wouldn't have given me a comic. I think it was my mom. I know I had some comics from when she was a kid, but I feel like she gave those to me after I could actually read. But I remember having a few issues of Superman and Action Comics, and I couldn't actually read yet, but I would still try and follow along the pictures in the comics, and then years later I would be super confused when I'd find them again in my closet and have no, like, this was the story? I had absolutely no idea. Though, to be fair, my older brothers also both read comics. I'm the youngest of 3 boys, and we are really close in age, though, so it's not like there were stacks and stacks of comics around before I was able to read, but I obviously got my hands on whatever comics they had around, some of which I believe I still have in my very own comic boxes. So I know that's not necessarily a satisfactory answer, but I honestly don't remember because it was before I could read. I was reading comic books. The next question, and it reads thusly, I'm quoting here, "The medium has matured for an adult audience. What comics should parents give kids?" And that's an awesome, awesome question. And because I'm me, it has many, many answers. So let's put it this way. When I was a kid, my mom had no worries about picking up random issues of Batman, Superman, or just giving me the money to get them, handing me comics without a second look. Because whatever, it's Batman and Superman, it must be fine. But it's true. Comics today deal with much more adult themes. Now, granted, the 80s were also the grim and gritty era, but I think publishers don't worry as much. It's still on the comic shelves along with everything else. However, depending on the age of your children, both DC and Marvel have series that are aimed directly at young kids. And they feature all of the characters that they would recognize, characters that are currently on TV or in the movies. The art is often very cartoony. So it's very much aimed straight at kids, which takes me to another suggestion. Speaking of cartoony, there are also comics out there based on cartoons. So you could just take their favorite cartoon. I know there's lots of, Transformers comics or Adventure Time comics and Invader Zim comics, which I guess isn't on the air anymore, but is around in comic book form. So you could also start there, and just to get them more into comic books, is start with something they already enjoy, but take that piece of advice with a grain of salt, because I remember growing up, as big a fan as I was of Batman the Animated Series, I never touched an issue of Batman Adventures. Because to me, it was just the drawn versions of the cartoon, and the real, quote, finger quotes, real Batman comics were also there for me to get at the library. So when we go to the library, you'd pick up, the Batman comics, and I would avoid Batman Adventures because to me it was just a drawn version of the story I'd already seen on television. So take that with a grain of salt, maybe flip through it and see if it's different if you watch the cartoons with your kids. I don't know. But in any case, that's a place to start. But you didn't think I was actually done with that question yet, did you? Beyond that, I would also personally suggest just talking to your kids. Ask them what sort of things they're into, and then bring that information to your local comic shop and ask the employees there, because they are going to know much more than me everything that's coming out. They might point you towards something independent like Lumberjanes, or something more mainstream. I would think that Miss Marvel, the current Spider-Man book, because it's Miles Morales now, so it is a teenager again, or Champions, which is the team book that just started that has Miss Marvel and the current Spider-Man in it, as well as the Young Nova. I think those would probably be good mainstream stuff. And then the last thing I would say about this is don't underestimate your kid's ability to handle mature content. It's very easy to sort of err on the side of caution and go for something that's more childish, but that might also turn them off of the medium. So think about if you read comics as a kid, think about what you were reading. Or if you weren't a comic fan, think about what you were watching. Think about the movies that you would watch, even when your parents weren't around, and think, did it really affect you that heavily? Maybe it did. I'm hoping that it didn't, and that if you're listening to this podcast, chances are you turned out just fine. So don't necessarily shy away from the adult stuff. Just maybe give it a flip through or ask the employees at the local comic shop if you're looking at something in particular. I wouldn't go diving for Watchmen, but at the same time, I'm sure there's people listening to this who read Watchmen when they were 13 or 14, and maybe some of the themes just went over their head on their first reading, but sometimes it's okay to go in on the deep end. Last question from one of my younger listeners. Hello. If I had a power, a superpower, what would it be? This could take up an entire podcast, but I will shrink it down to just the next 40 minutes or so. I'm kidding. If possible, if I could have any power, if we're talking general comic bookiness, it'd have to be a Green Lantern ring. Assuming that I had the willpower to actually make it work, because it gives you everything. You can fly, travel through space, make anything your mind comes up with. And so it's a creative person's dream, is that ability to make your thoughts come to life. Beyond that, if I'm being selfish, because obviously there's powers that would help the world at large sort of thing, the ability to heal, or I don't know, Magneto's power and you take all the guns away or whatever. If I'm being selfish, it would probably be Wolverine's healing factor, because assuming it's part of the power, you would stay in great shape all the time. You get to live a really long time, so you get to see the world and learn a lot, and then you heal, you really can't get sick. So I look at it this way. That power, just alone, not only allows you to get the most out of life, but you also get a longer life as well. So that to me seems really cool. That would be a very cool power to have if I'm being selfish. And then obviously having that healing factor means you could potentially go out and do things too dangerous for other people and save lives that way. You could go into more dangerous areas or harsher elements or something and do, I don't know, science-y things, but things normal people couldn't handle. So there, it's not completely selfish. It totally is, though. So many video games I want to play, just not enough time. All right, so with that, let us launch into our topic of the week. Map, down, Crisis on Infinite Earths and the end of the Bronze Age of comics. All right, I'll actually get into it now. Sorry. Beginning in the 1930s, DC Comics, which began actually as National Allied Publications, they've been telling all sorts of stories in all sorts of genres. It didn't immediately start out as superhero stuff, but obviously that's now the bulk of it because it's DC Comics. So naturally, with all these different characters, fans started writing in and asking for their favorite characters to meet. What would happen if Batman met Scooby-Doo kind of thing. So, and keep in mind, this is at a time when the terms team up and crossover weren't common. They weren't regular industry terms like they are now. You talk about a team up, you instantly get a picture of, Batman and Superman going and fighting crime together. If you say crossover, you're immediately thinking, oh, like, Superman and Spider-Man meeting from different companies, or an X-Men character in a Marvel movie or something like that. So these were not things at the time. It was just fans, children, mostly, reading these books and saying, I wonder what would happen. Who would win in a fight? Those sort of things. So being smart marketers, the comic companies went for it, and they have never been the same since. And that is great. But unfortunately, all of those team-ups then required publishers to take a hand in crafting the world around which their characters were existing. Stories they wouldn't only be able to exist on their own, they would need to fit within a world. So if we're looking at like Harry Potter and Fantastic Beasts, it's like you have Harry Potter's world and you're talking about Harry Potter, but for this other character to exist, all the fans come out and say, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? Because to them, it needs to make sense that Newt Scamander lives in the same world as Harry Potter if the people creating it claim that that's the case. Everything needs to stay consistent. So you have characters in the Justice League of America, for example, if they're referencing an event that happened in the pages of Batman, that's the sort of thing that people were at the very least looking for because they were supposed to coexist. And while you don't see it too often now, editors would then put an asterisk, a little star, the star key on your phone, kids. The asterisk would be put next to a reference if it had to do with something that happened in another book, and then there'd be a little box at the bottom of a panel from the editor telling you which comic you could read in order to learn about whatever event they were referencing. It was a nice bit of cross-promotion there as well. So over the course of 50 years, DC continuity, as we call it, comic book continuity, became very bloated and confusing. Take The Flash, for example. First created during what's known as the Golden Age of comics, which began in the 30s, Jay Garrick, the first Flash, was the only Flash around. But after World War II, when sales saw a sharp decline, in 1956 then, DC went and introduced a new Flash, Barry Allen, and that's what kicked off the Silver Age of comics. And then other characters like Green Lantern or the Atom also received updates where it was a completely new character, sometimes with completely different power sets, but they had the same name as a Golden Age hero. But eventually, fans wanted to know where the original heroes then had gone. So, what would that be? In 1961, so 5 years later, after The Flash was introduced, in Flash number 123, they introduced the concept of Earth 2 in a story called Flash of Two Worlds. And if you're a comic fan at all, you would instantly recognize this cover because it shows both Barry Allen, the Silver Age Flash, and Jay Garrick, the Golden Age Flash, who has the helmet with the wings on it. They're both running to save a man at the same time, but they're on opposite sides of a brick wall so they don't see each other. Like, that cover has been recreated and parodied so many times, and I think they even did it in the Flash television show last year. So in any case, they introduced this idea of a separate Earth that was just vibrating at a slightly different frequency, a different dimension. And Earth 2 is where all of the Golden Age heroes now live. And they were, separate, had their own timelines, and that helped them clean up their continuity a bit. So they could say anything that happened during the Golden Age was generally attributed to Earth 2. Interestingly, though, there were actually some characters that existed on both, like Batman and Superman, who were introduced during the Golden Age and were around during World War II, now also existed on Earth 2. So they introduced older versions of both Batman and Superman that lived on Earth 2. So while they were simplifying their storylines, saying they did all the Golden Age stuff, and our Batman and Superman on Earth 1 did all the Silver Age stuff, it was both confusing and not at the same time. I remember having Earth 2 comics as a kid, and I had no idea what was going on because Batman had gray temples and his daughter with Catwoman was Huntress, and I had no idea what was happening. So as a child, that was very confusing, but I imagine for older comic fans, all of that made sense. But that's not all. It wasn't just the Golden Age heroes, because DC had also, over the years, acquired the rights to characters from other publishers, such as Captain Marvel, and that's the red-suited guy with the yellow lightning bolt who yells Shazam to get his powers, not the character that's getting her own movie in the MCU. So not the actual Marvel version of Captain Marvel, but what originally was the Fawcett Comics Captain Marvel, and then later the DC, because DC bought out Fawcett Comics. And then there was, like, the Blue Beetle, or one of my personal favorites, The Question. They started out in a company called Charlton Comics, and then were acquired by DC. So in order to make sense of all of this, these characters also had their own Earths. So the Marvel family lived on Earth S, for example. And then over the years, many other Earths were created, like Earth 3, where an evil version of the Justice League known as the Crime Syndicate ruled with an iron fist, and the only hero capable of stopping them was the brilliant inventor, Lex Luthor. Oh, mind blown, it's the reverse world. So, while we're going through the Silver Age, we're getting introduced to all of these alternate Earths that are letting creators tell stories that don't rely on this massive, very quickly expanding DC continuity. And then in 1970, we got the Bronze Age of comics, or in the 70s. There's no specific date for this. And they call it the Bronze Age because we shifted out of the very sort of happy-go-lucky stories of the Silver Age and moved into some more serious real-world issues like racism and drugs. And a lot of this is introduced to Marvel. Sometimes they say the Bronze Age started with the introduction of Spider-Man, but I mean, one of the first comics that really launched it was also the Green Arrow, Green Lantern comic book over at DC. So comics were growing more serious, but with that, so was the fight to keep continuity consistent, because you have some characters that were aging very quickly as things were getting more serious. Dick Grayson is becoming Nightwing at some point and is now an adult, even though he used to be in high school, while Batman is still just as young as he's been since the 40s in the Silver Age, Earth 1 continuity. So by the 80s, series like Action Comics now have issues numbering well into the 400s, which obviously is off-putting if you're a new reader. You don't go and pick up an issue that says issue 378. You're like, okay, yeah, no, give me a number 1, please. Which is why we see so much of that today. But that's next week's episode. I'm getting ahead of myself here. So, something had to be done. Clearly, too many Earths, too many different versions of characters, issue numbers that are ridiculous. And so we got Crisis on Infinite Earths in 1985. Now, the term crisis was taken from a previous story called Crisis on Earth 1 and Crisis on Earth 2, which was the story that in DC canon was the first official meeting between the Justice League of America on Earth 1 and the World War II counterpart on Earth 2, the Justice Society of America. And then that became a thing because fans loved it so much. Every year, the Earth 1 and Earth 2 Justice groups of America would meet every year and get together via magic until Crisis on Infinite Earths in 1985. Before I launch into that book itself, very quickly I want to talk about crossovers as they existed. They had been around since at least 1965, which had a storyline called Zatanna's Search, that being the female magician who wears the fishnets and the tuxedo top, for those of you trying to figure out who Zatanna is. Because that one took place across the pages of Hawkman, Detective Comics, The Atom, Green Lantern, and Justice League of America. So for DC, it was the first time that they really went and had one story take place across multiple titles. But the first major crossover, the first company-wide crossover, actually happened at Marvel the year prior. And that was the Secret Wars comic, which was a limited series, which means it has a set relatively small number of planned issues. Think of TV miniseries versus a regular series. So it was a limited 12-issue series, and it had one goal: sell toys. It was the 80s, and it was the age of every kid's cartoon was strictly based around a toy line. So Marvel Comics got in on the action. They created a line of Secret Wars toys, and then created this 12-issue series where kids got to see their favorite heroes and villains duke it out on a completely separate planet known as Battleworld. But Marvel did a very cool thing here, because what they did is they made every single one of their comics jump ahead a full year to the end of Battleworld. So suddenly you had Spider-Man in a brand new black costume, and you had no idea what was going on. Everything had changed. What's happening? Well, kids, you're going to have to read Secret Wars to find out. And it was a 12-issue series, and it lasted all year long because they came out every month. Buy our toys. So while Marvel was doing the first major full comic publishing universe crossover thing, Crisis on Infinite Earths was getting planned out, and they were starting to plant the seeds within the various comic books. And while Secret Wars clearly had a big impact on the Marvel Universe, Crisis was going to be different because it was going to result in a full-on reset of the DC Universe. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. So for now, let's talk about the first 6 issues of Crisis on Infinite Earths. Issues 1 through 6. Holy dialogue, Batman. Comics really have changed. I will say right off the bat, I have touched this series before a little bit. I have flipped through it. I have tried reading bits. This is the first time that I'm going to be reading all the way through issues 1 through 12 in that order. So I am right there with you guys. And man, from Nightwing's disco collar and Supergirl having that aerobics headband to people blatantly talking out loud to themselves, or the thought bubbles, the omniscient narration, a lot has changed in comics since 1985. So this is very much a time capsule. We do not have that sort of thing. Comics today, they tend to give an experience that's a lot closer to watching a movie, where we're often shown instead of told. So sometimes we'll have inner monologues. If we do, they are in the narration boxes instead of thought bubbles these days. And more often than not, especially in a team book or books with, any number of multiple characters, all we get is their dialogue, and then the art takes over. And we have to look to the art to tell us what people are thinking. And, I'd almost want to see what this comic looks like if someone went in and stripped away some of the lettering, because the art is still fantastic in this book, but then it wouldn't feel so 80s, would it? And that's important. It is important for this thing to be super 80s. So for those that have not read it, and probably many of those that did, here is our massive, incredibly confusing story of these first 6 issues in a nutshell. Everyone in the DC universe is involved, and everything is insane. It turns out that when the Big Bang originally happened, it was supposed to create one universe, but instead ended up creating a multiverse, which consisted of many universes weaker than the intended whole. So, when a force approaches that is literally destroying entire universes with this wave of antimatter, and don't bother looking that up, it is not real antimatter. It doesn't work the way antimatter is at least theorized to work, because these weren't scientists writing this in 1985. They just liked the term antimatter, and we had dealt with antimatter universes and stuff before. So a wave of antimatter destroying these alternate Earths and these entire universes. And so heroes from multiple Earths and multiple eras are all gathered together to help defend what's to come. At the center of all this is a character named Pariah, a man who can't die and for whatever reason has been forced to travel to each doomed Earth and watch as it's being destroyed. And that he is made to do this by an enigmatic, I'm going to say, character called the Monitor, an immensely powerful being whose powers we have no idea. It's not defined at all, but a massively powerful being who guides his protege, Harbinger, who is this woman who also has incredible powers that aren't very well defined. And her job is to gather up all of these heroes. So she pulls them not just from Earth 1 and Earth 2. They come from all over the place, different Earths, different times even. Some are from like a World War II era. So she gathers all of these people together to help defend the 2 main Earths. And then the Monitor sacrifices himself in order to pull Earth 1 and Earth 2 into limbo outside of reality, where they are safe from the antimatter wave and where they can slowly be merged into one Earth. So for those that have been reading along with me, that's what you've been reading. It is a really thick read, and not in a good way. It's not like a Watchmen thick where there's just a lot going on and it's, there's some higher concept stuff. There's just a lot of stuff happening, and there's a lot of hints thrown out that aren't ever really fully explained, that I'm sure were just much easier to understand back when folks were reading monthly issues of all these books, because they're referencing things happening in all of the regular titles as well. And then there's characters that I don't necessarily recognize that were around in the 80s, but are unfamiliar, especially to readers today. All told, for the entire 12-issue series, I think there were 40 or so other issues of DC titles that tied into the event, like were official tie-ins to the event that showed the effects of the big battles and what each little things are doing. Because again, this is such a big story, all we get are little snapshots. So by the end of our 6th issue, our mysterious villain, the person who's doing all of this, has been revealed. He is also a being called the Monitor, but it's a reverse version, if you will, of our Monitor, an anti-Monitor, if you will. Hint, hint, wink, punch. And he grows more powerful as his antimatter wave sweeps across the multiverse and takes out universes. He's continuing to get stronger. By this point, the end of issue 6, we have seen the deaths of not just worlds, but recognizable DC characters who may or may not return, along with the introduction of brand new heroes, such as Dr. Light and Wildcat. New versions of both of those are very prominently shown. And those changes, I got to tell you guys, are nothing compared to what's going to come. Those are sort of important. I don't know that anybody remembers there being a female Wildcat. Certainly the female Dr. Light, but there are much bigger changes to come, obviously, because infinite Earths are in crisis. And that is actually where I think we're gonna stop for now. We're gonna put a pin in it. I'm gonna leave the rest for next week. So for next time, which might be in 2 weeks, depending on how Thanksgiving here goes and when I actually manage to edit this and get this out on your feeds. It might be 2 weeks, but I'm going to do my best to do it next week. In either case, be sure, do your best, do your homework, hunker down, and slog through issues 7 through 12 of Crisis on Infinite Earths. I will be talking about what happens through the end of that series, the big events that happen that still resonate today, 30 years later. Still resonate through the DC universe that happened in this series. The effect it had not just on the DC universe, but on the comic book industry as a whole, and on Marvel, and all of this amazing impact, and the post-crisis world as it existed for DC up until the New 52. This week was what came before. Next, we're going to talk what came after. And that is it for our topic of the week. I hope you guys are digging this, sort of the new format. Please let me know with a bop-a-doo, doo-ba-da-boom, dibba-da-da-ba-doo-ba-doom-bow, just because I want to transition into my That's It for This Week segment, the end show thing. Let me know what you guys think. Do you guys like this format? Are there questions you want me to answer? Are there other things that you think I could talk about that are as important as Crisis on Infinite Earths, or things you just don't know about comics? Let me know. You can find me on Twitter at Rob's Comic Box. I also have a personal account at Noby, that's at KNOWBY, where I talk about things not related to comic books. You can talk to me at our subreddit, which is reddit.com/r/geektogeekcast. You can email me at thecomicboxpodcast@gmail.com. However you want to get a hold of me, please do. Big shout out to Armando Chavez, who you can find on Twitter at Koji, I believe is how it's pronounced, at KOTJI, who left me a review on iTunes. I, of course, read every single one, and I appreciate all of the ratings and reviews you guys give me. They are very important to the show, which is why I bug you about them all the time. So to do that, head over to iTunes, search for the podcast as though you've never heard of it, and that is how you get to the part where you can actually leave me a review. So a star rating and review would be extremely helpful. Finally, this is part of the Geek to Geek Podcast Network. If you want information on any of the other Geek to Geek podcast shows, you can head to geektogeekcast.net and you can sign up for updates. Holy cow, it's amazing! Everybody have a great Thanksgiving! Crisis on Infinite Earths. Crisis on Infinite Earths. Probably not the theme song they would have gone with. It probably would have been something bigger like closing that comic box. I hope you have a great Thanksgiving. If not, I hope you had a great Thanksgiving and enjoy the rest of Crisis on Infinite Earths, you guys. And this year, I'm thankful for you.